My name is Joe, and I'm an alcoholic. And it's truly by God's grace and the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous and the program of Alcoholics Anonymous that comes from a book called Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm sober today, and for that I'm very, very thankful. I don't look like it, but I am an alcoholic. I ran out to the restroom just before we started the meeting, and a lady tapped me on the shoulder. She said, "Are you Joe of Joe and Charlie?" And I said, "Yes, ma'am." And she said, "You ever get nervous?" I said, "Not really." She said, "Well, you're in the ladies' restroom." Got to get over that. Before we get underway, I want to thank Don and the committee and whoever's had anything to do with putting this thing together, because I know they've done an awful lot of hard work doing this, and we appreciate them for that. But I especially want to thank each and every one of you for being here, because this would be a lousy meeting if it was just Joe and Charlie and Don, I can tell you that. So thank you guys for being here. We appreciate it very much. And I always like to hear the preamble at an AA meeting. Alcoholics Anonymous is a fellowship of men and women who share their experience, strength, and hope with each other that they may solve their common problem and to help others recover from alcoholism. The only requirement for membership is a desire to stop drinking. There are no dues or fees for AA membership. We are self-supporting through our own contributions. AA is not allied with any sect, denomination, politics, organization, or institution, does not wish to engage in any controversy, neither endorses nor opposes any causes. Our primary purpose is to stay sober and to help other alcoholics achieve sobriety. Did you all hear that story about the duck that went into the grocery store and wanted to get some grapes? The manager said, "We don't have any grapes." So the next day he went back in there and said, "Do you have any grapes?" The manager said, "No, we don't have any. I told you yesterday we don't have any grapes." The next day he went in and he said, "Do you have any grapes?" He said, "I've told you for 2 days now that we do not have any grapes. And if you come back in here one more time looking for grapes, we're going to staple your feet to the floor." The next day he walked in there, he said, "You have any staples?" He said, "No." I said, "You have any grapes?" My friend Charlie.
You might be a little bit alcoholic, you reckon? My name's Charlie Parman. I'm a very grateful recovering alcoholic. Because I'm a member of the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous, and by the grace of the power that I found through the 12-step program of Alcoholics Anonymous, I haven't found it necessary to take a drink for 12,420 days today, one day at a time. And for this, I'm very, very grateful. You guys look great. You really look great. Joe leaned over here a while ago and he said, "Charlie, this is the best looking bunch of sick people we've seen in a long, long time." It's great to be back up in the Chicago area. I haven't been up here for several years, and we've always enjoyed being up here. You've made us feel welcome all the other times, and certainly you've made us feel welcome this time. This is a tremendous amount of people for a big book study. Great to have you all here. We always like to say as we start one of these things, we do not consider ourselves to be the gurus of the Big Book Alcoholics Anonymous. We don't consider ourselves to be the experts on anything at all. We're just two old drunks, met together several years ago, found we have a mutual interest in the Big Book. We studied it together for quite some time. Hopefully, we've learned a few things about it. And those few things we've learned about it, we just love to be able to share them with other people. We do not attempt to speak for AA as a whole, and you are most certainly free to agree or disagree with anything that we say throughout the entire weekend as you see fit. In fact, if you hear us saying things that can't be reconciled with what's in the Big Book, we suggest you just don't pay any attention to those things at all. And we'll try to keep our comments particularly centered upon the book. We also know that the mind will only absorb about what the rear end will stand. And some of these sessions do become quite long. And if you feel the need to get up and move around during one of these sessions, please feel free to do so. That's not going to bother us at all. If you feel the need to go get a cup of coffee, I'm told that it's always going to be available downstairs. If you feel the need to go out and smoke a cigarette, If you feel the need to go get rid of a cup of coffee, please feel free to do that. Tonight we're not going to take a break. It's already past 7:30. And if we tried to take a break tonight, we'd probably be here till 11 o'clock or so. So we're just going to go straight through. And if you feel the need to get up and move, well, please feel free to do that. It won't bother us at all. Joe and I love to laugh. We love to cut up. We love to have fun. We love to tell jokes. And we love to hear other people laugh also. And from time to time, we may stop whatever we're doing, tell a little joke just to get some humor started. And if we tell a joke and it isn't funny, we'll go ahead and laugh anyhow. It'll make you feel better, it'll make us feel better, and it'll make the one next to you feel better also. We're going to have one special request this weekend. We're going to ask that nobody ask us to sign any books. We've been doing that for a long, long time, and for the last few years it's been kind of bothering me. I kind of feel it's a violation of our 12th tradition, placing principles or personalities ahead of principles. You know, in AA we're all equal. We don't have any big shots. We don't have anybody on pedestals. And it's finally got to where it bothered me to the point that I asked Joe if it'd be all right with him if we didn't do so. So we're not going to sign books this weekend. Not necessarily because we don't want to, but it's just one of those things that's been bothering me, and I just haven't felt right about it for a long time. So with your permission, we'll not do so. Okay? All right.
Thank you.
Now, one little story I always like to tell before we start the big book study, which I think is so appropriate for we alcoholics. It's a story about a brain surgeon. And this brain surgeon had developed a way to transplant the human brain in its entirety. Now, they've been doing it for years with other organs of the body, and he figured out a way to do it with the human brain. And this older fellow went to see him, a guy about my age, went to see him and said, "Doc, my brain's not working very good anymore." Said, "I can't remember anything. I can't think like I used to. I can't figure things out. Do you think you might be able to help me?" And the surgeon said, "Well, let's give you a physical examination and see what kind of shape your body's in first." And he gave him a physical exam, and he said, "Oh, yeah, your body's in great, great shape." He said, we could transplant a brain in your head and everything would be fine." The old man said, "Well, what do you have to offer?" And the surgeon said, "Well, come up here in the display room and I'll show you what we have in stock at the present time." He took him up in a display room and he said, "Now, in this case over here, I have the brains of an attorney." He said, "I could transplant this in your head. It would cost you $20,000 and everything would be great." The old man said, "Do you have anything else?" And he said, "Yeah, in this case over here, I have the brains of a doctor." He said, "I could transplant this in your head. Everything would be fine. It'll cost you $50,000. And the old man said, "Well, do you have anything else?" And he said, "Oh, yeah. In this case over here, I have the brains of an alcoholic." He said, "I could transplant this in your head, and it'll cost you $100,000, and everything will be great." The old man said, "Well, I don't understand this deal. $20,000 for the attorney's brain, $50,000 for the doctor's brain, and $100,000 for an alcoholic brain?" The doctor said, "Well, hell yes, man. It's brand new. It's never been used before." I think most of us will go to the grave with about 50,000 miles left on the original warranty that we never got around to touching. If we're going to talk about the big book, which of course we are this weekend, I think we need to go back and look at just a little bit of the history behind the book in order to be able to understand better the book as we go through it. And I think one of the best places we can find some of the history behind our book, what the original members had to go through in order to be able to write the book and produce it as we've got it today, can be found in the foreword to the second edition. So if you guys are ready, we'll just open our books and we'll go to the foreword to the second edition. And in my third edition book, it is Roman numeral
15.
15. Is it the same for the fourth edition?
Yeah.
Okay, Roman numeral 15. And let's go to the last paragraph on that page, and we'll start there. Roman numeral 15.
there's a thing that Bill did that, in his writings, and if you'll notice it in the big book, and you'll notice it in any other writings that you see Bill when he writes something. Bill will always do certain things. He'll always tell us what the problem is. He'll give us a solution to that problem. Then he'll give us a practical program of action to implement the solution that he just described. He does that over and over and over. And keeping that in mind, we'll see we can understand Bill's writing a whole lot better. Roman numeral page 15, bottom of the page. The spark that was to flare in the first AA group was struck at Akron, Ohio in June 1935 during a talk between a New York stockbroker and an Akron physician.
Now, we know this New York stockbroker to be this fellow named Bill Wilson. I think we're treating Bill pretty good when we call him a New York stockbroker. He really was a New York City stock speculator. He made his living out of selling fast-talking to slow-thinking people, just like so many of we alcoholics do. Don't want to take anything away from Bill. He was a great man. But we all need to realize that he was a real alcoholic, just like the rest of us. The Akron physician, of course, is this fellow named Dr. Bob Smith.
Now, 6 months earlier, the broker had been relieved of his drink obsession by a sudden spiritual experience following a meeting with an alcoholic friend who had been in contact with the Oxford groups of that day.
Later on, when we get into Bill's story, we're going to see where Bill was visited in his home by an old friend named Ebby Thatcher, an old drinking buddy. This is the latter part of November of 1934. And Ebby and Bill used to drink together. They went to school together. And Ebby sat down with Bill in Bill's kitchen and gave Bill what later turned out to be two very valuable pieces of information. He said, Bill, people like you and I that have become absolutely powerless over alcohol, if we are to recover from that condition, we're going to have the aid of a power greater than ourselves. And he said, I've been attending meetings with a group of people that told me that if I could have a vital spiritual experience, that during that experience I would find that power greater than human power, and I would be able to recover from alcoholism. He said, also, Bill, these people have given me a practical program of action. And they told me if I would apply that program of action in my life, I would have that spiritual experience and I would recover from alcoholism. And he said, look at me, Bill. It's been 2 months since I've had a drink. And this made a great impression on Bill. He knew Ebby Thatcher and he knew how Ebby drank. And he knew that if Ebby was staying sober for a period of 2 months, there had to be some power greater than Ebby working in Ebby's life. And what Ebby really gave to Bill turned out later to be, first, he gave him the solution to alcoholism, the vital spiritual experience during which we find the power greater than human power. And secondly, he gave him the program of action necessary to find that solution. So two of the things that Bill needed to know in order to recover from alcoholism came to him through Ebby Thatcher from the Oxford groups. But there's also some other information that Bill had to know in order to recover.
He'd also been greatly helped by the late Dr. William D. Silkworth, a New York specialist in alcoholism, who is now counted no less than a medical saint by AA members, and whose story of the early days of our society appears in the next pages. Now, from this doctor, the broker learned the grave nature of alcoholism.
And again, later on, when we get into Bill's story, we're going to see where Bill was placed in the town's hospital in the summer of 1933 to be withdrawn from alcohol by a doctor named Dr. Silkworth. And after Bill was withdrawn and his mind cleared a little bit, Dr. Silkworth sat down with Bill and explained to Bill his ideas that he had about this thing called alcoholism. And he said, Bill, I do not believe that alcoholism is a matter of moral character. I don't believe it's a matter of sin. And he said, I don't think willpower has got anything to do with it. He said, I really believe that people like you are suffering from an illness. And he said, it's a very peculiar illness because it's a twofold illness. He said, it's an illness of the body as well as an illness of the mind. And he said, I believe people like you, when you take a drink of alcohol and put it in your system, something happens to you physically that doesn't happen to normal people. He said, it seems to me as though any time that you put alcohol in your system, it produces an actual physical craving that demands more of the same. And he said that craving is so strong that it's beyond your ability to control the amount you drink after you have once started drinking. And he said, I believe you have become physically allergic to alcohol, and that because of that you'll never be able to safely drink alcohol again as long as you live. But he said that's only half of your problem. He said in addition to that physical allergy, I also believe you've developed what we call an obsession of the mind. And he said an obsession of the mind is an idea that overcomes all ideas to the contrary. And he said it really doesn't make any difference how badly you want to stop drinking. And it really doesn't make any difference how hard you use your willpower. From time to time, the obsession of the mind is going to tell you that it's okay to take a drink. And believing that this time it's going to be different, you will take a drink, then that drink will trigger the physical allergy, the phenomenon of craving to develop, and you'll end up drunk and sick every time. He said you can no longer safely drink because of the body, nor can you stay sober because of the obsession of the mind. Therefore, you have become absolutely powerless over alcohol. And Bill Wilson was very relieved to hear that, because he'd been wondering for years why he couldn't drink like other people. He'd been wondering for years why he couldn't quit now that he wanted to quit, irregardless of how hard he used his willpower. And he said to himself, well, self-knowledge will fix it. And we know that he left the town's hospital in the summer of 1933. Shortly thereafter, he took a drink, triggered the allergy, and couldn't stop drinking. Ends up back in the town's hospital in the summer of 1934, a year later. This time, Dr. Silkworth pronounced him incurable and told Bill's wife, Lois, unless this guy is locked up somewhere, or you hire a bodyguard to go with him, he's going to die during DTs, or he'll become absolutely insane, one of the two. And Bill overheard that. And he said that fear sobered him up for a bit also. But on Armistice Day 1934, his mind told him it was okay to drink. And Bill took a drink of alcohol. So self-knowledge and fear didn't fix the situation. And toward the end of that November is when Ebby came to see him and brought him the other two pieces of information. Now, knowing three things, Bill was able to effect a recovery from alcoholism. He knew the problem. He got that from Dr. Silkworth in 1933. He knew the solution. He got that from Ebby in 1934. He knew the program of action, which also came from Ebby in 1934. And then Bill applied the program of action, had a spiritual experience, and then he recovered from alcoholism.
Ebby began to take Bill to these Oxford group meetings, no AA at the time. And he said, the book says, though he could not accept all the tenets of the Oxford group, he was convinced of the need of the moral inventory, confession of personality defects, restitution to those harmed, helpfulness to others, and the necessity of, belief in, and dependence upon God, which were the tenets of the Oxford group, which later on some of them were expanded into the 12 Steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. Bill began to stay sober. He liked this idea of helpfulness to others. He wanted to help other people as Ebby had helped him. So he went about his business in New York, going into some of those bars and dragging those guys off the bar stools and taking them to the Oxford group meetings. Most of them didn't want to go, but he's taking them anyhow because it's helping him stay sober. He singed a bunch of them up out of the gutters and took them to the Oxford group meetings, trying to help them stay sober. And after about 6 months of this activity, nobody was staying sober. He went back to Dr. Silkworth and said, look, I've been out there trying to help these people stay sober, and nobody seems to want what I have. And Dr. Silkworth said, yes, Bill, I've heard about some of those shenanigans that you're pulling out there on the streets with those drunks, dragging them off to those Oxford group meetings, trying to shove that great spiritual experience down their throat, and they just won't accept it. He said, why don't you do for them what I did for you? Why don't you talk to them about the illness of alcoholism? Explain to them about the physical allergy and the obsession of the mind. And if they can understand and accept that, then you can talk to them about spiritual matters.
He said, Bill, every alcoholic I know has two questions. Number one, why can't I drink like I used to without getting drunk? And number two, why can't I quit now that I want to quit? He said, if you will explain to them the exact nature of their illness, you'll get their attention. And then you can talk to them about spirituality. But tell them what's wrong with them first.
See, prior to his journey to Akron, the broker worked hard with many alcoholics on the theory that only an alcoholic could help an alcoholic. But he has succeeded only in keeping sober himself. So working with other people was helping Bill stay sober. But the broker had gone to Akron on a business venture, which had collapsed, leaving him greatly in fear that he might start drinking again. He suddenly realized that in order to save himself, he must carry his message to another alcoholic. That alcoholic turned out to be an Akron physician. Now, we all know the story of Bill being in Akron and engaged in a proxy fight, and if he'd won that fight, he and his family would have been set up real good financially, but the fight fell through, and he was walking up down the corridors of the Mayflower Hotel broke, sad and depressed. Didn't even have enough money to pay his hotel bill. And I think about this a lot sometimes. Bill walking up and down in there, and he said, should I go in the bar there and strike up an acquaintance, or should I go help a drunk? And I think about that decision. Would I do that? And I don't think I would. I think I'd have went in the bar. And if I'd have went in the bar, we wouldn't be here tonight. And we talk about Alcoholics Anonymous being built on seconds and inches. That's really all we got to talk about. If I'd have been over there a few seconds longer or inches over this way, I'd have killed those people back. And that's all we really got to talk about now. Hey, Bill made a decision that he'd go in that down to the end of that hotel corridor and find him a drunk to work with. And he went down there and went down to about 10 different names and finally came into the contact with the name of Walter Tunks. He said, I'll try this guy. So he called him up and said, do you know, he said, the way he put it, he said, I'm a rumhound from New York. Do you know of any alcoholics in this area that I could help? Because I need to find one to help because I'm afraid I might get drunk. And Walter Tunks said, no, I don't know any alcoholics personally, but I know someone who does know someone. And he called up Henrietta Seiberling. And he said, Henrietta, there's a fellow from New York who seems to have a solution for alcoholism, and he wants to talk to a drunk. And I know that you know one named Dr. Bob. And she said, yes, have him call me. So he called. And he told her that he was a rumhound from New York and he wanted a drunk to work with. She said, I've got just the fellow. As a matter of fact, 2 weeks ago, our little Oxford group meeting had a prayer service for Dr. Bob, hoping that he might find a way to stay sober. And she felt that that was the answer to their prayers, this guy calling up. So she calls Ann over there, said, Ann, we've got this fellow from New York who seems to have a solution for alcoholism. Bring Dr. Bob over, and we'll see if they can get together and give Dr. Bob the solution. She said, I'd love to bring him over. In fact, you know, it's the day before Mother's Day, and Dr. Bob had brought me a potted plant. As a matter of fact, he's underneath the table with that potted plant sitting, and he's too drunk to get there. So, but I'll bring him over tomorrow. So the next morning, Ann got ready to take Dr. Bob to meet Bill Wilson. You can just imagine this conversation. Dr. Bob's got a real bad hangover. She said, Dr. Bob said, we're going to take you over to Henrietta Seiberling's house. We've got this fellow from New York who seems to have a solution for alcohol. He said, I'm not going. I feel too bad. She said, oh, yeah, you're going. And he said, oh, no, I'm not. You know how it goes. She said, oh, yes, you are. He said, all right, okay, all right. I'll go over there and I'll spend 15 minutes with this fella and no more. That's all. And they went over there, and Dr. Bob and Bill went off into another room. And Bill did something different this time. He sat down with a well-trained physician, and he began to talk to him about the illness of alcoholism. He explained to him about the physical allergy and the obsession of the mind and how that worked with him, weaving that through his story. And Dr. Bob said, yes, I'm just like that. I identify with it. I'm just like that. Man, you do know what you're talking about. Later on in some of his writings, he said that he was a fellow, for the first time he'd ever talked to anybody who really knew what he was talking about, and he stayed there with Bill more than 5 hours, promising to go just 15 minutes, because here was a real solution.
Our book says the physician had repeatedly tried spiritual means to resolve his alcoholic dilemma, but had failed. He already knew the solution. He was already trying to find a power greater than himself. He already knew the Oxford Group program of action, but he had never been able to apply it to the depth necessary to be able to overcome alcoholism because he didn't know what was wrong with him. He thought it was willpower. He thought it was moral character. He thought it was sin. Why would he not? That's what everybody had told him at that time. But when the broker gave him Dr. Silkworth's description of alcoholism and its hopelessness, the physician began to pursue the spiritual remedy for his malady with a willingness he had never before been able to muster. He sobered, never to drink again up to the moment of his death in 1950. This seemed to prove that one alcoholic could affect another as no non-alcoholic could. It also indicated strenuous work with one alcoholic with another was vital to permanent recovery, the very two things our whole fellowship is built upon. They discovered that afternoon. You see, Bill didn't really go over there to sober up Dr. Bob. Bill Wilson went over there to keep Bill Wilson from getting drunk. He remembered back in New York City every time he had tried to help another alcoholic, even though he had helped no one, he himself had felt better. So that's why he got hold of Dr. Bob, to keep Bill from getting drunk. Strenuous work, one alcoholic with another, was vital to permanent recovery. Also, one alcoholic sharing with another is vital to permanent recovery. Because Bill didn't talk to Dr. Bob about Dr. Bob's drinking. He talked to him about Bill Wilson's drinking. And he talked about the many, many times he had stopped off in the saloon or the speakeasy just to have one drink on the way home. He said something would happen, and I'd be unable to quit drinking, and I may not get home till midnight that night or the next night or the next week. And Dr. Bob said, "My God, man, that's what's been happening to me." And Bill explained to him the physical allergy from Dr. Silkworth. Bill talked about the tremendous amount of willpower that he had. He had always been able to do anything he wanted to do, but he said when it comes to alcohol, it seemed as though I have no willpower whatsoever. I'll swear off drinking one morning, and that afternoon I find myself in the bar drunk, wondering how. Dr. Bob said, "My God, man, that's what's been happening to me." And Bill explained to him about the obsession of the mind, and for the first time, Dr. Bob could see how hopeless his condition was, that willpower would not work, period. Then he applied the Oxford Group program deeper than he ever had before, and he recovered from alcoholism. Hence the two men set to work almost frantically upon alcoholics arriving in the ward of the Akron City Hospital. Their very first case, a desperate one, recovered immediately and became AA number 3. He never had another drink.
Bill and Bob were sitting there talking one night, and Dr. Bob said, "Bill, if we're going to do this thing, we better get busy." He said, "Get busy doing what?" He said, "Well, get busy helping drunks. You said that would help me. Let's get busy helping some drunks." He said, "But I don't know any of the drunks in Akron." And Dr. Bob said, "Well, I don't either." He said, "I think I'll call down to Akron City Hospital and talk to that head nurse down there. I know her pretty well. Maybe she knows one." So he called down, got a hold of her, and said, "Look, I've got this fellow from New York who seems to have a solution for alcoholism, and part of it is trying to help other alcoholics to stay sober. Do you know of any alcoholics?" And she said, "Well, yes, I do, Dr. Bob." And he says, "He has a solution for alcoholism?" He says, "Sure." She said, "Well, by the way, Dr. Bob, have you tried this on yourself?" She was well aware of his problem, although he didn't think she was. And he said, "Yes, I have, and I'm staying sober." He said, "Yes, we have a fellow down in the ward of the hospital. And those of you who don't know what a ward is, at the end of a hall where they put some screens around you when you can't afford a private room or a semi-private room, they call that a ward. And it looks like you're going to die, they'll take you off the ward and put you in a private room or a semi-private room." So they took this fellow off the ward and put him in a semi-private room, a private room, and which was AA number 3, and his name was Bill Dotson, the lawyer. And they went in there that next morning, and they didn't talk to Bill Dotson about Bill Dotson drinking. Many, many people had talked to Bill Dotson about Bill Dotson drinking. You shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that, and this and that. This time, Bill and Bob went in there and they told him, said, "Look, we're alcoholics, just like you are. We have a physical allergy and obsession of the mind." They explained that to him in great detail. And they didn't talk to him about what Bill Dotson should do or ought to do. They told him what they had done. And he began to accept that information. The next morning, he was looking, and Dr. Bob and Bill was coming down the hall, and his wife was standing there. She said, he told his wife, said, "There they are. Those are two fellows I've been talking to. I thought they were pigments of my imagination. I thought I was in delirium tremens, but that's them. They have a solution for get my clothes. I'm getting out of here, and I'm going to go do what they done." And they went and got his clothes. He left there, never had another drink as long as he lived. Bill Dotson, AA number 3.
You see this picture in AA rooms all over the world called The Man on the Bed. That's Bill and Bob sitting there talking to Bill Dotson, sharing their stories. This work at Akron continued through the summer of 1935. There were many failures, but there was an occasional heartening success. You know, back in the summer of 1935, these guys, they really didn't know what they were doing. You know, everything was new. And they would try this, and if it worked, they would keep it, and if it didn't work, they would discard it. Every once in a while, they would try something that didn't work, and one of them died on them. Dr. Bob saying he was always wanting to give them sauerkraut juice mixed with honey. The sauerkraut juice had the vitamins in it. The honey made it able for them to swallow and drink the stuff. And they tried that amongst many things, and every once in a while one of these guys would die. And I can just see Bill turn to Bob and say, "Oh shit, let's don't do that again." We always give credit to the first 100, but we ought to give credit to those that they fail with too. They probably learned more from the failures than they did from the successes. When the broker returned to New York in the fall of 1935, the first AA group had actually been formed, though no one realized it at the time. When Bill went back to New York City that fall, he left just a few people behind him, alcoholics who were staying sober, on these 3 little pieces of information. And they were members of the Oxford group. Now, from the very beginning, though, they had some problems between the alcoholics and the regular Oxford groupers. The regular Oxford groupers, they were not into the business of sobering up drunks. You know, they wanted to work mainly with the more elite members of society and maybe help the mayor get straightened out and maybe help the governor get straightened out and maybe help the head of states getting out and et cetera.
You've heard that trickle-down theory. That's what
they wasn't too crazy about working with drunks, because drunks would come to the meetings and they would tell dirty jokes and drink coffee and smoke cigarettes and drop ashes on the floor and et cetera.
Kind of like we do today.
Yeah. The Oxford groupers, they had a thing called the 4 absolutes, where you were to practice absolute love, absolute purity, absolute honesty, and absolute unselfishness. And the drunks were having a hell of a time being absolute anything except drunks. So to separate themselves from the Oxford groupers, they called themselves the drunk squad of the Oxford group. That's what Bill left behind him when he went back to New York City.
No AA.
Now, when he went back to New York City, he did there what he had tried with Dr. Bob. He found him a drunk, and he began to share his story rather than talking about spirituality. And the next thing you know, somebody in New York City got sober. And then they got another, and they got another, and they got another. The book says a second small group had promptly taken shape in New York. And besides, there were scattered alcoholics who had picked up the basic ideas in Akron or New York and were trying to form AA groups in other cities. By late 1937, the number of members having substantial sobriety time behind them was sufficient to convince the membership that a new light had entered the dark world of the alcoholic. Once again, Bill was back in Akron on a business deal. And while there, he went by to see Dr. Bob, see how they were doing in Akron. And they sat down in Dr. Bob's kitchen, and they counted the number of people that they knew that were staying sober on these 3 little pieces of information. And they found approximately 40 people staying sober. And I think for the first time, they began to realize we just might have the answer to this thing called alcoholism. And immediately the question becomes, okay, if we've got the answer to it, what are we going to do about it? Are we going to franchise it and sell it? Are we going to keep it here in Akron? Are we going to extend it to New York City? What are we going to do about membership? How are we going to carry this thing to other people? And one thing coming out of the Oxford groups always said that if you're going to keep it, you have to give it away. Thank God for that. And this might have been the start of the group conscience, because Bill and Bob decided they didn't want to make that decision. And they called a meeting there of the Oxford groupers there in Akron, who were interested in the alcoholism thing. Not all of them alcoholic. There was a total of 18 people at that meeting. And that night they decided to do three things. Number one, they decided that in order to carry this message to as many alcoholics as we can, we need to build a chain of hospitals stretching all the way across the country so any alcoholic can have detox prior to trying to talk to them about what the program actually is. And I imagine Dr. Bob was probably going to be the head doctor. They also made a decision that we're going to hire and train a group of people. Not everybody would be capable of carrying this message, so they'll have to have special training. And we'll send them out all the way across the country.
Call them missionaries.
They call them missionaries, and I imagine Bill was going to be the head missionary. And then they said, you know, this information that we've got, that started back in 1935, within 2 years, as it's going from one to another by word of mouth, this information is already becoming garbled, and it's becoming changed. And if we want the alcoholics in the future to have the same information that's available to us today, we better get it down in written form. And they made a decision to write a book about alcoholism. And they just knew back in those days, now this was in the days before television. There really was a time before television, believe me, there was. And people did a lot of reading, and they knew that this book would be the first good book on alcoholism that the world had ever seen, and it would just sell like hotcakes. Some of the Oxford group books did, and they figured this one would too, and they would take the profits from the book, and then they would build the hospitals and hire and train the missionaries with the book profits. So the book originally was designed for two reasons. Number one was to keep the message pure. Number two, to make some money out of the thing too. And of course we know that when it was first published it didn't sell very good. They didn't make very much money out of it. Therefore we didn't get to build the hospitals and train the missionaries. It turned out to be the greatest thing that ever happened to AA. But what it did do, it was take their information that they knew, their knowledge that they had about alcoholism, and let them teach it to us today through the book, so that we can recover from alcoholism as they did years and years and years ago.
Can you see the mind of the alcoholic at work here, going to build hospitals all the way across the U.S. and Canada? Nobody had any money, but they were going to build hospitals all the way across.
Yeah, right in the midst of the Depression, too.
Right. Our book said it was now time the struggling groups thought to place their message and unique experience before the world. This determination bore fruit in the spring of 1939, and by the publication of this volume, the membership had then reached about 100 men and women. They decided after they wrote the book, and this is the book that we're going to raffle off Sunday morning.
Now, the first Alcoholics Anonymous that the world ever saw was a book called Alcoholics Anonymous. And in this book contains the knowledge and experience and wisdom of that first 100 people who recovered from alcoholism. Now the book says the fledgling society, which had been nameless, now began to be called Alcoholics Anonymous from the title of its own book. Remember, those people were known as the drunk squad of the Oxford groups. So after the book was published, then the little fellowship which published the book took their name from the title of the book. So in 1939, we had 2 Alcoholics Anonymouses.
Still do.
We had a book which contained the knowledge, the experience, the wisdom of how to recover from alcoholism by the first 100 men and women. Then we had a society which had written the book called Alcoholics Anonymous from the title of its own book. In 1939, there was no quarrel between the program in the book and the program in the fellowship. Those in the fellowship had practiced what was in the book, and they had found out what their problem was. They had found out the solution to it, and they had practiced the program of action and had a spiritual experience and recovered from alcoholism. So there was no quarrel at all in 1939. But the book began to go out across the country. And the first person here in the state of Illinois that got a copy of this book, they read it, they studied it, they did what it said, got sober, recovered from alcoholism, and then they started an AA group. The first one in Texas did the same thing. First one in California. The first one in Mississippi. The first one in Florida. So the growth of the fellowship began to come from the book Alcoholics Anonymous. And all the people coming into the fellowship practiced the book, had a spiritual experience, and recovered from alcoholism. But as time went by, and the fellowship got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, they began to notice something that the first 100 didn't have. They began to notice the great amount of strength and power which comes from large numbers of people joining together who have recovered from a same common problem known as alcoholism. And when they begin to feel the strength and the power from the fellowship, they then begin to question the severity of the program in the book. And people begin to say, you mean we really have to turn our entire will and life over to the care of God as we understand Him? Couldn't we give Him the alcohol and we'll keep the rest? Do you mean we're going to have to share all of our life story with another human being? Hell, God already knows about it and we know about it. What good would it do to share it with another human being? You mean we're going to have to get rid of all of our character defects? Hell, we won't be able to make a living if we do that. You mean we have to make amends to all those people we've harmed, even those that have harmed us? And they begin to say, well, maybe we don't need to do everything that's in here. Maybe we can treat it like a cafeteria. Maybe we can take some and maybe we can leave some and everything will be okay and we'll still be able to stay sober through the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. And slowly, the program and the fellowship begin to change. And they begin to push the book to the side. Then in the 1970s came the great advent of the treatment centers. Now please don't get us wrong. We have nothing against treatment centers. They do serve, in many, many cases, a very good, vital function. But in most treatment centers, if you're going to have something going in a treatment center, you can't depend entirely upon what's in a book. So in a treatment center, we begin to bring in the professionals, and we begin to bring in the psychiatrists and etc. And we begin to go into group therapy sessions. And we begin to experience a language that we'd never heard before in AA. People begin to come from treatment centers into AA, and they wanted to sit around in a group therapy session and talk about their problems rather than their solutions. And we begin to hear such things as dual addiction and chemical dependency and polyaddiction, and people begin to talk about dysfunctional others and significant others and dysfunctional sex and et cetera, until you go to some AA meetings today. And if you didn't read the preamble before the meeting, you wouldn't know what kind of meeting you're in. Because they're talking about everything except alcoholism and recovery therefrom. We call those group depression meetings. You go in there feeling pretty good, hell, halfway through, you might as well just blow your brains out there. So what we're going to do this weekend, we're not going to talk about the program in the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. We're going to talk about the program in the book Alcoholics Anonymous. And I think one of the greatest miracles that the world has ever seen is this book has gone through now a 4th edition. And so far, we haven't found it necessary to change the program in the book Alcoholics Anonymous. It's exactly the same today as it was in 1939.
It's not that they haven't tried to change it, but they've tried.
They're trying to change it every year.
Yeah. I remember years and years ago, I called, my sponsor name was Franklin Williams at the time, and I said, Franklin, my program's not working. And he said, well, tell me about your program. So I told him. You already know what he's going to say, right? I said, Phyllis is upset. I'm upset with her, and I'm upset with the group, and I'm upset with the people I work with, and I'm just generally upset with everybody. And he said, well, Joe, your program's working just the way it was designed to work. He said, have you ever tried working the program? And there's a lot of difference between my program and the program, I can tell you. And let's look and see on Roman numeral page 20 what kind of successes they were having when the fellowship was practicing the program out of the book, Alcoholics Anonymous, in the early days of AA. It says, while the internal difficulties of our adolescent period were being ironed out, public acceptance of AA grew by leaps and bounds. For this there were two principal reasons: the large number of recoveries and reunited homes. These made their impressions everywhere. Of alcoholics who came to AA and really tried, 50% got sober at once and remained that way. 25% sobered up after some relapses. Among the remainder, those who stayed on with AA showed improvement. Other thousands came to a few AA meetings. At first decided they didn't want the program, but great numbers of these, about 2 out of 3, began to return as time passed. As my math is correct, that's 75% of those people who came to AA and really tried got sober. Today in AA in my area, I don't know about up here, I think I do, but in my area, we can't even fantasize about 75% of those people that come. Can't even talk about 50%. No way 25%. 5% maybe. I'm not sure. But I do know that there's pockets of AA, big book people all over the country, including Chicago, and where they have those big book studies, we see the recovery rate beginning to increase. And that's really what our message is here tonight. We're hoping that somebody here will go back home and start a big book study group in their hometown or in their group and try to look at the program that's in the book called Alcoholics Anonymous. 1958, Bill Wilson wrote this little pamphlet. I didn't write it, and Charlie didn't write it. Bill Wilson wrote it, one of the co-founders of Alcoholics Anonymous. And in it is a number of things talked about. And I think that every Alcoholics Anonymous member should read this little pamphlet. It's free at the central office. And on the third page here, right there, I'm going to tell you what Bill Wilson said. He said, sobriety, freedom from alcohol, through the teaching and practice of the 12 steps, is the sole purpose of an AA group. That's not one of the purposes, is it? It's the only purpose for an AA group is the practice and teaching of the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. The sole purpose, that is our seamless of purpose, if you will. The sole purpose is the practice and teaching of the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. And the question is very simple. Go back to your groups, listen to what's going on around the table, and are we practicing and teaching of the 12 steps as a group or not? And if we're not, maybe we ought to have a little group consciousness and agree to get back to that purpose of practicing and teaching of the 12 steps. That's the sole purpose of an AA group. Now, we're not going to preach anymore tonight.
No more preaching.
No more preaching. Maybe tomorrow, but not tonight.
You know, I think one of the reasons that our recovery rate got down so low is we simply quit practicing the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. And people began to try to stay sober on fellowship only. And it worked for a period of time. Almost anybody can get sober on the fellowship. But for a good long time, peaceful, happy, serene fellowship, you know, something has to change. Unless we're using a program of action, we're not going to change. And I think a lot of the old-timers in AA like to blame this on the newcomer. They say, well, those newcomers are coming in here from treatment centers and they want to talk about everything except alcoholism, and we can't identify with them, and we're just going to stay home. Now, when the old-timer does that, that means we've abdicated our responsibility for AA. We've turned it over to the sickest of the sickest, who are the newcomers, and we stand back and say, look what they're doing to our AA. I don't think it's a newcomer problem. I think it's an old-timer problem. And I think those of us in AA that's got good long-term sobriety, our responsibility is to talk to the newcomer. Yeah, sure, that stuff you learned out there is okay. Great information. But that's not AA information. Here's AA information. And we start talking about the information in the big book Alcoholics Anonymous. We start talking about the problem and the solution and the program of action and show them how to apply it in their lives. You know, that's called teaching. And a lot of people don't like the term teaching. They think it's trying to tell somebody what to do. But teaching is nothing more than transference of information from the mind of one human being to the mind of another. The big book is teaching us from the minds of the first 100 how to recover from alcoholism. And if we older members in AA will help the newcomer do that and insist that they get into the program when they come in AA, then after a while we turn this whole thing around.
It's called sponsorship, isn't it, Charlie?
First one of these that we did in a formal setting was 27 years ago. And we would go into a city and there might be 30 or 40 people there. And most of the people had told them, don't you guys go listen to Joe and Charlie. Hell, they're going to get you drunk as sure as anything. And talked about all the money we were making out of this deal and all the things they could think of bad to keep people from coming. Tonight I sit here and I'm almost crying.
That's right.
I'm almost crying when I sit here and see over 800 people in this room tonight wanting to talk about the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. You know, our whole fellowship is changing. It's slow, but it's changing, and it's happening all over the country. I'm glad I've lived long enough to see it. Now that we know a little about the history, let's go to the table of contents. Let's begin to look at the layout of the book.
There's some information on every page of this book in the table of contents. There's some information on it.
And you have in your handout material that was given to you now, we're going to put a little picture up here on the screen, and you have a picture to match it. So if you can't see the screen or you're too far away to see it, we'll have it up here on the board. And the first one deals with the table of contents.
When I was working, I was in the printing business, and I printed books like this. It was my business. And I've sat in on many, many discussions about a book, nomenclature of a book, how to lay out a book. And when I got sober, I must have had a lot of brain damage, because when I looked at this book, I thought, well, you know, what do a bunch of old drunks know about laying out a book? That's the way I was thinking. Come to find out, they knew an awful lot about laying out a book. Because in this book is laid out pretty much the way Bill received his sobriety, if you will. Any book has 3 goals in it, or many goals, but this one has 3 goals. And the first goal of this book is to tell us what the problem is. And they're going to do that through the doctor's opinion and Bill's story. They're going to explain what the problem is. The second goal of this book is to tell us what the solution is. And chapter 2, there is a solution. And Bill realized that we didn't like that solution any more than he did. Remember, he was aghast at the solution presented to him? Well, he knew that some of us were going to be aghast at that too. So he wrote down in chapter 3 more about alcoholism, more about what might happen to us unless we accept the solution that was described. And he knew that we were going to have problems with that solution just like he did. Remember, he said his mind snapped shut against such theories? And he said that we were going to have the same kind, some of us were going to have the same kind of problem. So he wrote chapter 4 called We Agnostics. The word Gnostic means knowledge. He put the ag in front of the word means without. Those of us who are without knowledge, or the knowledge that we do have is limited. When I arrived at Alcoholics Anonymous, I had the spiritual knowledge of a 7-year-old boy. And you can imagine what that was. We'll talk more about that later. And then he's going to tell us the third goal, which the action is necessary to recovery. And remember that action is the key word, is the magic word in Alcoholics Anonymous. Chapter 5, he said how it works. He's going to tell us how it works. Chapter 5 begins with step 3, by the way. Chapter 6 says into action. Now, this is not into thinking, but into action. Action is a magic word. Then once we've had this solution presented to us and we have recovered from alcoholism, he's going to tell us in chapter 7 a whole chapter about how to work with others and to carry this message to other people. That's the way the book is laid out. And when you can see how the book is laid out, this book becomes a fascinating book to me. Every chapter is right where it belongs. Every paragraph is right where it belongs. Every line is right where it belongs. It's laid out in very, very good form.
You know, I hear people today say they're going to a step study meeting. and invariably they're referring to the 12 and 12. But if you're studying the big book, you're studying the steps, because each one of these sections of the book is laid out to bring out certain steps for us. For instance, in the doctor's opinion and Bill's story, we see nearly all the information that we need for step 1. You know, we can boil step 1 down to one word: we're powerless. And we see that powerless condition through the doctor's opinion and through Bill's story. And remember, that's what Bill had to learn in order to recover from alcoholism. He learned that in the summer of 1933. Now, if our problem is powerless, then obviously the answer would lie within power. So the next 3 chapters, chapter 2, 3, and 4, they're all dealing with step 2, where we came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. It talks about the insanity of alcoholism. It talks about this power necessary to recover. It gives us some new ideas about that power so that we can be able to make a decision about it. So all the information we need for step 2 is in chapters 2, 3, and 4. That Bill had to learn that from Ebby, brought that to him from the Oxford groups. Then Ebby also brought him the Oxford group program, which we're going to see later on in Bill's story turned out to be the last 10 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. And we find that in chapters 5, 6, and 7. So we're in a step study meeting anytime we're studying the big book Alcoholics Anonymous. Also, we'll find that it is written in a certain sequence to bring these ideas about as we go through the thing. When I first started looking into the book, I had no idea that it was written in a certain sequence. I might read chapter 3, and it talked about the insanity, and I didn't like that at all. And then I'd go to chapter 2, and it would talk about a lot about God, and I sure as hell didn't want to do that. And then I'd look in chapter 5, and it told me what I was going to have to do. Well, hell, I wasn't going to do any of those things. And then I would go back and read a story in the back of the book, and then I just jump back and forth in it. Today I realize it is written in a certain sequence to convey these ideas, give them to us in the sequence that the rest of them had to know in order to recover from alcoholism. And when you look at it in that manner, it becomes a very fascinating book to be able to see how one chapter dovetails, ties into the next chapter, to the next chapter, to the next chapter, and etc. as you go through the book. Never having realized that before. So the table of contents, the layout of the book, is just exactly covering those 3 things. What is the problem? Step 1. What is the solution? Step 2. And what's the program of action necessary to find it? The last 10 steps. Now let's go to the preface for a moment. Roman numeral 11.
He said, and this says, because this book has become the basic text of our society and has helped such large numbers of alcoholic men and women to recovery, there exists a sentiment against any radical changes being made in it. Therefore, the first portion of this volume describing the AA recovery program has been left untouched in the course of revisions made for both the second and the third edition. The section called the doctor, and now the fourth edition. The section called the doctor's opinion has been kept intact, just as it was originally written in 1939 by the late Dr. William D. Silkworth, our society's great medical benefactor.
Probably 2 little ideas here to look at. First, because this book has become the basic text for our society. I think we're alerted to the type book we have in front of us. You know, there's lots of books in the world today. There's novels written on fact, novels written on fiction, there's biographies, autobiographies. We can name many different kinds of books. But we all know what a textbook is. Now, some of us look at a textbook with aversion because we remember back in school we had to read and study and take tests, and we didn't like the idea of a textbook.
When I first thought about textbook, I thought about cheating like I always did.
But a textbook is simply a tool that is used in teaching. And remember, teaching is nothing more than transference of information from one mind, the mind of one human being, to the mind of another human being, increasing the knowledge of the one who's being taught. A textbook is a tool that is used to teach with for the transference of that information. Let's look at a textbook on mathematics. We'll find that most textbooks are written in a certain sequence too, by the way. A textbook on mathematics. Let's say that my friend Joe here knows nothing at all about mathematics. He can't add, he can't subtract, he can't do any of those things. Oh, he might be able to count to 20 if he's standing there naked, or 21 if he's standing there naked and got everything where it's supposed to be. He might make 21.
Yeah, 20 and a half, actually.
And I hand him a textbook on mathematics, and I say, Joe, I want you to go to chapter 5 and work the algebra problems. Well, being a good fellow, he'll go to chapter 5 and look at it, but he just sees a bunch of marks and scribbles on paper. He has no idea what to do. But if I say, Joe, this textbook on mathematics, chapter 1, deals with the value of numbers, addition and subtraction. Read it, study it, ask questions, let me help you when necessary. You'll learn how to add and subtract. And sure enough, he does that. And I say, now that you know how to add and subtract, you can go to chapter 2 and you can learn how to multiply and divide. And sure enough, he does that. And then we go to chapter 3 and we learn about fractions and decimals, gradually preparing his mind for the algebra problems in chapter 5. I think the greatest mistake being made with a big book today. A newcomer walks in the door, we hand him a copy of the book, and we say, go to chapter 5 and do what it says, and you'll be okay. And they go to chapter 5, and they see a series of algebra problems. Step 1 said, we admitted we were powerless over alcohol. Our lives had become unmanageable. The newcomer said, hell, man, I'm not powerless over anything. They have no idea what we mean by that statement. Step 2 said, came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. Newcomer said, man, don't tell me I'm crazy. Yeah, I do some stupid things when I'm drinking, but when I'm sober, I'm like other people. They have no idea what we mean by that statement. Now, if you're not powerless and you're not nuts, then you don't need to be thinking about making a decision to turn your will and your life over to the care of something you don't understand in the first place. We present them with an impossible situation. If we can do nothing else all weekend, I hope we're going to be able to see the value of the doctor's opinion in the first 4 chapters. They are there to prepare our minds for chapter 5, because you see chapter 5 starts with step 3. And you can't start 3 unless you got 1 and 2 behind you. Standard textbook procedure. 1 chapter leading to the next, to the next, to the next. The other greatest thing about it is that there exists a sentiment against any radical changes being made in it. Therefore, the first portion of this volume describing the AA recovery program has been left untouched in the course of revisions made for the others. You know, in 1955, they said the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous is changing so much. More and more women were coming into AA. People were coming in younger and younger. Bottom was coming up and up. They said we need to change the stories in the back of the book. They are there for the newcomer to identify with. So they came out with a second edition. All they did was drop some old stories and add some others. Did the same thing in 1976 with the third edition, and did the same thing here lately with the fourth edition. But the recovery section has been left untouched, and we've never found it necessary to change it. I wonder why. Anybody care to venture on why we've never changed the recovery section?
It works.
It works, doesn't it?
It really does.
It works. You know, alcoholics haven't changed. They're still doing the same thing today they did in 1939. They get drunk. They get in jail. They get in divorce courts. They get in knife fights. They get in jailhouses, penitentiaries, and cemeteries. Alcoholics are still doing the same fun things today that they did in 39. Alcohol hasn't changed. It's exactly the same as it was in 39. They've changed the names of it. The bottles have changed, the containers have changed, the colors have changed. Hell, I heard one the other day called Peach Fuzz. I have no idea what the hell Peach Fuzz is, but if it's got alcohol in it, it's just like bourbon whiskey. I know that. Some of you shaking your head, yeah, you must have been trying some Peach Fuzz. Human nature never changes. It's the same today as it was in 1939. And that's what the big book really deals with. Alcoholics, alcoholism, and human nature. And we haven't found, and I think that's the greatest miracle of all. God, you know how we love to change things, Joe.
Let's go to the forward to the first edition. Some real good information in this first paragraph. And the first word says we. And that's probably the biggest word in all of Alcoholics Anonymous, we. We can do what I cannot do. We of Alcoholics Anonymous are more than 100 men and women who have recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. That's two different things. A little bit later on tonight, we're going to separate those two items. We're going to talk about the body in great detail, and then we'll talk about the mind in great detail. Now, this is to show other alcoholics precisely how we have recovered. And when you see little italic words in this book, Charlie calls them squiggly writing, but they're really italic. He'll try to confuse you. It bears to be read again. To show other alcoholics precisely how we have recovered is the main purpose of this book. Later on in this book, you see words like precisely, specifically, exactly, with clear-cut directions on how to recover. And if I want to recover like the first 100 did, guess what? I need to do precisely, specifically, exactly, follow the clear-cut directions like they did, or I might not recover from alcoholism. For them, we hope these pages will prove so convincing that no further authentication will be necessary. We think this account of our experience will help everyone better understand the alcoholic. Many do not comprehend that the alcoholic is a very sick person.
I think there's two little short ideas to look at there also. First, we of Alcoholics Anonymous are more than 100 men and women. I've already been alerted to the fact that this is a textbook, and I'm also alerted to the fact that this is not a one-author book. You know, most books I read have been written by one author. And if I read a book that's been written by one author and I see something in there I don't agree with, I say, well, who in the hell are they to think they're smarter than I am? And I just don't ignore it. But if I do that with a big book, I'm not arguing with one person. I'm going to be arguing with 100 men and women. The first 40 told Bill, they said, we want you to write the book. They said, you've been sober longer than any of the rest of us, and that was just a little over 3 years. They said, you know more about it than any of the rest of us. We want you to write the book. But they said, Bill, this is not to be your book. It's going to be our book. And as you write the chapters, we want to see them. And we will add to, delete from, change around, whatever we think is necessary. And we're through with it. It'll be the collective knowledge, experience, and wisdom of all 40 of us. Well, by 1939, that had turned to 100 people. So I got to remember today, if I'm going to argue with what this book says, I'm not arguing with one person. I'm arguing with 100 people who have recovered from the same thing that's killing me as a practicing alcoholic, this thing called alcoholism. And that makes it a little harder for me to argue with them. And that brings about the word recovered. You know, we hear people almost go into fistfights in AA over the word recovered and recovering. And you're going to find the word recovered all the way through the book. You know, they have recovered from a hopeless condition of mind and body. I usually introduce myself as a recovering alcoholic, but I'll tell you why I do that. My recovery gets better as I go on and work this program and apply it in my life on a daily basis. Before I came to AA, I lived in a hopeless condition of mind and body known as alcoholism. I could not drink without getting drunk, and I could not keep from drinking, and my life became an absolute living hell. I came to AA and I practiced the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. I still cannot successfully drink, but by golly, I don't have to drink today. I've recovered from the hopeless condition of mind and body known as alcoholism. I'll always be alcoholic, but I've recovered from that condition, and my recovery continues. As I try to practice these principles in all my affairs on a daily basis, my sobriety becomes better and better and better and better. So we really can recover from alcoholism. We're not cured of it, but we've recovered from it. I believe that with all my heart.
The book said there that many do not comprehend that the alcoholic is a very sick person. Certainly I did. When I first come to AA, I stood in the back of the rooms. I was ashamed of what I had become. I thought it was a moral issue, that I was a no-good, rotten SOB. That was a problem, but that was not my problem. But I was ashamed. I wasn't about to tell you or anybody else what I'd done, because if you knew me, you wouldn't like me either, because I didn't like me either. And so I looked down at my feet. Many do not have any comprehension that they might be alcoholic or might be a very sick person. I had no understanding of that. That was not part of my vocabulary, that I was a sick person. Come to find out, that's what I was. We're going to talk about the doctor's opinion now, to get some understanding, some comprehension of the illness of alcoholism.
One more thing before we go to the doctor's opinion. To show other alcoholics precisely how we have recovered is the main purpose of this book. It's kind of like making cake. Let's go to an AA potluck meeting, and let's say that somebody has made a strawberry cake, and that's my favorite. If you ever make one for me, make it strawberry. I love it. And I go to that potluck meeting, and I bite into a piece of that cake, and my God, it's just perfect. The texture is just perfect. The taste is just perfect. The moisture content's just perfect. And I say, who made this cake? And you being a good cook, well, you probably say, well, I made it. And I'd say, well, will you tell me how? And you say, sure, I'll be glad to. And you'll sit down and write out for me a precise set of directions on how to make that cake. You'll tell me the ingredients to put in it, the quantity of the ingredients to put in it, the sequence in which to mix them together, the temperature at which to bake it, and how long to bake it. Now, if I take your directions in my kitchen and I follow them precisely as you've laid it out, when that thing comes out of the oven and cools off and I bite into it, I think I can expect it to taste just exactly like your cake tasted. But if I take your directions in my kitchen and my keen intellectual alcoholic mind begins to work, it may say, well, I don't know about 3 cups of sugar. I think it ought to have 4. And instead of baking it for 18 minutes, I think I'll bake it for 24 minutes. Instead of baking it at 375, I'll bake it at 450. When that thing comes out of the oven and I bite into it, sure, I'm going to be biting into a piece of cake. But I wonder how closely it would resemble your cake, which was my reason for making it in the first place. A precise, specific, clear-cut set of directions on how to recover from alcoholism. And if we follow them as they did, then I think we can expect to get what they got, recovery from a hopeless condition of mind and body known as alcoholism.
So we'll go to the doctor's opinion on the 3rd edition on Roman numeral page 23 and the 4th edition Roman numeral page 25. Because this information about the doctor's opinion for me personally was very, very important. Because like I said, I thought it was a moral issue. I thought I was no good writing SOB. But I began to read and understand the doctor's opinion, and it opened up my mind to the idea of an illness. A few years ago, I was speaking at a place, and I talked about the doctor's opinion. This fella came up afterwards, and he was an old-timer in AA and the guardian of the fellowship through the tradition. And I like those people, but I really do have learned to love and respect them because they're trying to help us. And he come up to me and said, what are you reading? I said, well, I'm reading the doctor's opinion. Had a little blue cover on it at that time. And he said, where'd you get it? I said, out of this book. He said, what book is that? I said, the big book. He said, well, show that to me. And I showed it to him, and he turned and left. The next day, I was standing around in the lobby, and he came up to me afterwards, and before he got to me, he started crying. He said, Joe, I've been a member of the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous for 39 years. And I did not know that information was in that book. And he said, well, I'll tell you one thing. When I get back home, there'll be a big book study in my hometown, and we'll get to the bottom of this big book. And 6 months later, he called me and said, we're having more fun studying this book now that we understand what the problem is. The doctor's opinion is one of the most important chapters in the book. As a matter of fact, I thought it was so important that in the original printings of the book, first 16 printings, they put the doctor's opinion on page 1. 1955, they made the first changes in the book, the stories in the back of the book. For some unknown reason, we don't know why, there was no conference action that led up to this, or no one approved it or anything, but they took the doctor's opinion off of page 1 and put it in the Roman numeral section. And we all know that alcoholics don't read Roman numerals, do we? They put Bill's story on page 1. So we just skip right over that and go into Bill's story and not even read the doctor's opinion. Many do not comprehend that the alcoholic is a very sick person and hear the doctor's opinion. As a matter of fact, the rest of the book is going to tell us how to recover from the condition of the body and mind that he described. I mean, it's real nice to know what the problem is, isn't it? Real nice. We got to know what the problem is before you even solve anything. And the doctor's opinion is going to tell us how to do that.
I don't think we alcoholics who are members of AA today really realize how lucky we are. You know, prior to 1930, most alcoholics did not recover from alcoholism. Most of them don't today, but prior to 1930, very few ever recovered from alcoholism. Alcoholism is not anything new. You know, it's been with humankind as far back as recorded history can go. The thing that is new is today we know what alcoholism is. But prior to 1930, prior to Dr. Silkworth, we had no idea. We thought it was willpower. We thought it was moral character. We thought it was sin. You know, you can go back and one of the oldest recordings of human history is found in the Bible. And there was a fellow in the Bible named Solomon. And you know who Solomon was. He was a very, very learned individual.
First social worker the world has ever known, Solomon.
People who had problems would go to Solomon to solve those problems. And Solomon wrote Proverbs in the Bible. And in Proverbs in the Bible, Solomon describes we alcoholics. Somebody apparently asked him about alcoholism or the drunkard or whatever they called it in those days. And he said, who has woe, who has sorrow, who has redness of eyes, they that tarry long at the wine. You know, back in those days, everybody was a wino. That's before they got the hard stuff. And he said, you will be as one who lieth down in the midst of a sea. Remember how you used to go to bed at night and that old bed start moving around on you? Or he said that sleepeth at the top of a tall mast. And he said you will awaken in the morning and you will find that they have beaten you and you remember it not. You remember how you used to get up in the morning and you got bruises all over you and you don't know how in the hell you got them? And he surely do some of us men. He said, and thine eyes shall behold strange women. And thy heart shall utter perverse things.
Yeah, like trust me, honey. Please trust me.
But then he said the most telling thing of all. He said, when they arise in the morning, they seek it yet again. Almost a perfect description of alcoholism as we know it today. So alcoholism is not new. What's new is we found out what it is. And now that we found out what it is, we found a solution for it. See, prior to 1930, we didn't have that. Dr. Silkworth came along. Now, Silky was always interested in alcoholics for some reason, even back in his medical school days. But back in the early 1900 period, you couldn't hardly make a living working with alcoholics. Doctors didn't like to work with alcoholics then. They don't like to work with us today. You know, they say the reason we don't want to work with alcoholics is they won't do a damn thing we tell them to do. And they said they will lie to you all the time. But the real reason they don't like to work with us, they say we won't pay our bills. And that's probably the truth too, you know.
Most doctors like to work with rats.
But Silky, every opportunity he had as a young doctor coming up, he tried always to work with drunks, work with alcoholics. Finally, due to the great stock market crash in 1929, Silky lost everything he had, just like so many people did. And he was offered a job in this little town's hospital in New York City to work with alcoholics. And he started working with us in 1930. Now, I have no idea how many people he worked with before Bill Wilson came along in 1934. We have no idea whether he told other people this or Bill was the first one. We simply know that in working with alcoholics, he would see us come in there, he would withdraw us from alcohol, they would keep us in there about 30 days, feed us good food, vitamins, etc., get the body in pretty good shape, and then we would leave. And the next time he saw us 2, 3, 4, 6 months later, we'd be back in there in worse shape than we were the first time. And he began to discern some differences between alcoholics and non-alcoholics. He noticed that some people he worked with didn't have to come back in there.